The baby's wailing cut through the scorching afternoon air like a blade, and Clara Thompson knew with a sickening certainty that they were going to die out here if someone didn't find them soon. She pressed her cracked lips together and held her 18-month-old brother Thomas closer to her chest, trying to shield his tender skin from the relentless Colorado sun. They had been walking for 2 days now, ever since their father's wagon had broken an axle 15 miles back, and he had told her to wait with the baby while he went for help. That had been 48 hours ago, and Clara was beginning to understand that he wasn't coming back. He had left them, just as their mother had left them when she died birthing Thomas, just as everyone in Clara's 21 years had eventually left one way or another. The landscape around Fort Garland stretched endlessly in all directions, a harsh wilderness of sagebrush and distant mountains that seemed to mock her with their indifference. Clara stumbled again, her worn boots catching on a rock, and this time she couldn't stop herself from falling. She twisted at the last second to protect Thomas, landing hard on her shoulder with a gasp of pain. The baby shrieked louder, his little face bright red and streaked with tears and dust. "Hush now, Tommy," Clara whispered, though her own voice cracked with thirst. "Please hush, sweetheart. We're going to be all right." But they weren't going to be all right. She knew that now. The small canteen of water her father had left them was empty, drained yesterday evening. The few pieces of hardtack were gone. Clara's vision swam with dark spots, and when she tried to push herself up, her arms trembled so badly she collapsed back onto the hot earth. This was how it would end, then. 2 more bodies claimed by the unforgiving West, their bones picked clean by vultures and scattered by wind. No one would even know their names. Clara felt tears leak from the corners of her eyes, precious moisture she couldn't afford to lose, but she couldn't stop them. She had tried so hard to keep them alive, to be strong enough for both of them, but she was just a girl herself, abandoned and alone. The sound of hoofbeats registered somewhere in the back of her consciousness, but Clara thought she must be hallucinating. No one came out this far. No one would have any reason to. She closed her eyes and held Thomas tighter, whispering a prayer her mother had taught her long ago. Miss, can you hear me?" The voice was deep and concerned, and definitely real. Clara forced her eyes open and found herself staring up at a man on horseback, silhouetted against the burning sun. She couldn't make out his features with the light behind him, but she could see the broad-brimmed hat and the rifle strapped to his saddle. "Please," Clara managed to croak. "My brother. Help my brother." The man was off his horse in an instant, kneeling beside her with a canteen already uncapped. "Easy now," he said, supporting her head with one strong hand while he brought water to her lips. "Slow sips, not too much at once or you'll be sick." The water was the most glorious thing Clara had ever tasted. She wanted to gulp it down desperately, but the man controlled the flow, letting her drink just enough before pulling the canteen away. Thomas was still crying, and the stranger turned his attention to the baby, dribbling water carefully into the little boy's mouth. Thomas choked and sputtered, then latched onto the canteen, opening like a lifeline. "There you go, little fellow," the man murmured. "That's better, isn't it?" With the sun no longer directly behind him, Clara could finally see her rescuer clearly. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of whiskey. Dark hair curled from beneath his hat, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, his shirt dusty and his leather vest worn soft with age. But it was his expression that struck Clara most. There was genuine kindness there, and concern that seemed entirely unfeigned. "My name is Kieran Nash," he said, meeting her eyes. "I've got a ranch about 3 miles east of here. Can you tell me what happened?" How did you end up out here alone with a baby? Clara swallowed hard, her throat still painfully dry despite the water. Our father, she began, then stopped. Was he their father anymore if he had abandoned them? The man who brought us here left us when the wagon broke. He said he'd go for help, but he never came back. Something flickered in Kieran's eyes, anger perhaps, or disgust. His jaw tightened. How long ago? 2 days. 2 days. Kieran's voice was flat, controlled, but Clara could hear the fury underneath. He left you and a baby alone in the wilderness for 2 days with no water, no shelter. Clara nodded mutely. She felt Thomas growing heavy in her arms as the baby finally quieted, exhausted from crying and soothed by the water. Kieran looked at them both for a long moment, then seemed to come to some kind of decision. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I think so. If you help me up, I'll do better than that." Before Clara could protest, Kieran scooped her and Thomas up in his arms as though they weighed nothing at all. He carried them to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood patiently while its master maneuvered his passengers into the saddle. Then Kieran swung up behind Clara, one arm coming around her waist to steady her while the other hand took the reins. "Hold tight to your brother," he instructed. "Lean back against me if you need to. I won't let you fall." Clara wanted to protest that she could sit up on her own, that she didn't need to rely on a stranger's strength, but her body had other ideas. The moment the horse began moving, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave, and she found herself sagging back against Kieran's solid chest. He didn't comment on it, just adjusted his arm to support her more securely, and kept the horse to a smooth, steady walk. The 3 miles to Kieran's ranch felt both endless and over too quickly. Clara drifted in and out of awareness, conscious mainly of Thomas's weight in her arms, the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her, and the warmth of Kieran at her back. When she opened her eyes again, they were approaching a collection of buildings set against the foothills of the mountains. The main house was modest but well built, with a covered porch and glass windows that spoke of prosperity. Beyond it, Clara could see a barn, a corral with several horses, and what looked like bunkhouses for ranch hands. "Home," Kieran said simply, and Clara heard something like relief in his voice. He brought the horse right up to the porch steps, then dismounted and reached up to take Thomas from Clara's arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake, and Kieran cradled him with surprising gentleness for such a large man. Then he helped Clara down, keeping one hand on her elbow when she swayed. The front door burst open, and a woman in her 50s rushed out onto the porch. She had graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and wore a simple calico dress covered by a flour-dusted apron. Her eyes widened when she saw Kieran's passengers. "Good Lord, Kieran, what happened?" she demanded. "Found them 3 miles west, Mrs. Patterson. They've been abandoned without water for 2 days. Kieran's voice was grim. "They need food, water, and rest. Can you help them while I tend to my horse?" "Of course, of course." Mrs. Patterson hurried down the steps, clucking with concern. "You poor dears. Come inside at once. I'll get you fixed up properly." Clara found herself ushered into a comfortable parlor and deposited on a sofa with soft cushions. Mrs. Patterson took Thomas from Kieran, and the baby's eyes fluttered open. When he saw an unfamiliar face, his lower lip began to tremble. "It's all right, Tommy," Clara said quickly. "She's kind. She's helping us." Thomas looked to his sister, seemed reassured by her presence, and settled back down. Mrs. Patterson smiled and jostled him gently in her arms. "What a sweet boy," she cooed. "And so well behaved despite everything you've been through. Kieran, fetch some milk from the cold box and bring bread and cheese too. Nothing too heavy for their stomachs just yet." Kieran nodded and disappeared through a doorway that Clara assumed led to the kitchen. Mrs. Patterson sat down beside her, still holding Thomas, and studied Clara with sharp but compassionate eyes. "I'm Alina Patterson," she said. "I've been housekeeper here for Kieran since his mother passed 3 years ago. Now tell me your names, dear." "I'm Clara Thompson," Clara replied, her voice still hoarse. "And this is my brother Thomas. We call him Tommy." "Thompson," Mrs. Patterson repeated thoughtfully. "And the man who abandoned you, he was your father?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, madam. Our mother died when Tommy was born, and my father, he never really recovered from losing her. When the wagon broke down on the trail, he said he was going for help, but I don't think he ever meant to come back. I think he saw it as a way to be free of the burden of us." The words hurt to say aloud, to acknowledge that her own father had cared so little for his children that he would leave them to die. But there was no other explanation that made sense. If he had truly intended to return, he would have been back within hours, not days. Mrs. Patterson's expression darkened with anger, but her touch remained gentle as she smoothed Tommy's hair back from his forehead. "That man should be horsewhipped," she said firmly. "Children are a blessing, not a burden, and any man who can't see that isn't worthy of the name father." Kieran returned carrying a tray laden with food and drink. He set it on the low table in front of the sofa, then poured a glass of milk and handed it to Clara. She drank it slowly, savoring every drop. Kieran prepared a small piece of bread soaked in milk for Tommy, and Mrs. Patterson fed it to the baby in tiny portions. Tommy ate eagerly, making happy sounds between bites. "He's a hungry little man," Kieran observed with a slight smile. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges and making him look younger, more approachable. Clara found herself staring and quickly looked away, focusing on the cheese and bread Kieran had provided. They ate in companionable silence for a while, and Clara felt strength slowly returning to her body. The food sat well in her stomach, and the cool interior of the house was a blessed relief after 2 days under the merciless sun. She watched Kieran from beneath her lashes, trying to understand why he had helped them. Most men she had known would have passed by, unwilling to take on the responsibility of a young woman and a baby. But Kieran had not only stopped, he had brought them to his home, was feeding them and seeing to their care as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "What will you do now?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently when they had finished eating. "Do you have family elsewhere? Someone we could send word to?" Clara shook her head. "No, madam. It was just my father and Tommy and me. My mother's family disowned her when she married my father, and his family is all back east. We haven't had contact with them in years." She paused, then added in a small voice, "I don't know what we'll do. I don't have any money anyway to support us. I can work, though. I'm strong and I learn quickly. If someone in Fort Garland would hire me, maybe I could earn enough to keep us fed and sheltered." "Fort Garland is a rough town," Kieran said, his tone carefully neutral. "The options for employment for a young woman without connections or references are limited and often unpleasant." Clara understood what he was delicately not saying. She had heard stories about the saloons and dance halls where desperate women ended up. The thought made her skin crawl, but she would do even that if it meant keeping Tommy safe and fed. Her own dignity and comfort mattered less than her brother's survival. "I'll do whatever I have to do," she said, lifting her chin. "Tommy is my responsibility now. I won't let him suffer because of our father's choices." Kieran and Mrs. Patterson exchanged a long look, some wordless communication passing between them. Finally, Kieran leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and pinning Clara with his steady gaze. "What if I offered you another option?" he said slowly. "This ranch is a big operation. I run cattle primarily, but also breed horses. It's more work than one man can handle alone, even with my crew of ranch hands. Mrs. Patterson manages the house, but she's not as young as she used to be and the work is getting harder for her. What if you stayed here? You could help Mrs. Patterson with the household tasks, and in return, you and Tommy would have room and board, safety, and a roof over your heads. Clara stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. You would do that, she whispered. You don't even know us. We're strangers. You're people in need, Kieran replied simply. And you were left to die by someone who should have protected you with his life. The way I see it, you deserve better than that. You deserve a chance to build a life for yourself and your brother without fear or desperation driving your choices. But why? Clara pressed. What do you get out of this arrangement? Surely it would be easier to just give us some supplies and directions to town and be done with us. Kieran was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. My mother raised me alone after my father died when I was 10, he finally said. She worked herself to the bone to keep this ranch running, to give me a future. I watched her struggle and sacrifice everything for my sake, and I swore that if I ever had the opportunity to help someone in a similar situation, I would. You remind me of her, Clara. You have that same fierce determination to protect someone you love, no matter the cost to yourself. I respect that, and I want to help. Tears pricked Clara's eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and relief rather than despair. I don't know what to say, she managed. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. It's plenty, Kieran assured her. Now, Mrs. Patterson, why don't you show Clara and Tommy to the spare room? They need proper rest. We can discuss the details of the arrangement tomorrow when they are recovered. Mrs. Patterson stood, still holding Tommy, and gestured for Clara to follow. Come along, dear. The room is upstairs, nice and quiet. I'll bring up water for washing, and we'll find you some clean clothes to wear. Clara pushed herself to her feet, her legs still wobbly but functional. She paused in front of Kieran, wanting to say something more to express the depth of her gratitude, but words failed her. Instead, she simply placed her hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture of thanks and trust. Kieran looked up at her, his whiskey-colored eyes warm, and nodded in understanding. The room Mrs. Patterson led her to was simple but clean, with a real bed covered in quilts, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the ranch. There was even a small cradle in the corner, dusty from disuse but sturdy. Kieran's mother kept this for when she hoped he'd marry and have children, Mrs. Patterson explained, seeing Clara's gaze. She passed before that happened, but I've kept it maintained. Your Tommy can sleep here. Clara ran her fingers over the smooth wood of the cradle, overcome with emotion. In the span of a few hours, she had gone from certain death to this safety, kindness, and a place that might become home. Mrs. Patterson brought water and cloths for washing and helped Clara clean herself and Tommy up. The baby was asleep almost as soon as his head touched the small pillow Mrs. Patterson had placed in the cradle. Clara changed into a clean nightgown that was too big but blissfully soft against her sun-burned skin and climbed into the bed. She expected to fall asleep immediately, exhausted as she was, but instead found her mind replaying the events of the day. Her father's abandonment still hurt, a deep ache in her chest, but somehow it was duller now, overshadowed by Kieran's unexpected kindness. What kind of man took in strangers without hesitation? What kind of man looked at a desperate young woman and a baby, and saw not a burden but people worthy of help? Clara thought of Kieran's eyes, the way they had softened when he looked at Tommy, the gentleness in his hands despite their obvious strength. She thought of his words about his mother, the clear love and respect in his voice when he spoke of her. And she thought of the way he had held her in the saddle, secure and protective, as though keeping her safe was the most important thing in the world. It was dangerous to think such thoughts, Clara told herself sternly. Kieran was being charitable, nothing more. She was an employee now, or at least she would be once she started helping Mrs. Patterson with the household work. It would be foolish and presumptuous to read anything more into his kindness than simple human decency. But as Clara finally drifted off to sleep, she couldn't quite banish the memory of how right it had felt to lean against Kieran's chest, or the warmth that had bloomed in her heart when he had said he would help them. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of Tommy babbling happily in his cradle. She sat up with a start, disoriented for a moment before memory returned. The ranch, Kieran Nash, safety. She climbed out of bed and went to Tommy, who grinned at her and reached up with both arms. Clara lifted him, marveling at how much better he looked after just one night of rest and proper food. His color was good, his eyes bright, and he seemed to have already forgotten the trauma of their ordeal in the way that only very young children could. There was a soft knock at the door, and Mrs. Patterson entered carrying a bundle of clothes. "Good morning, dear," she said cheerfully. "I hope you slept well. I've brought you some dresses that belong to Kieran's mother. You're about the same size, I think, and they'll do until we can make you some new things." Clara accepted the clothes gratefully and dressed quickly, choosing a simple blue calico dress that fit reasonably well with only minor adjustments needed. Mrs. Patterson showed her how to tie the apron strings, then took Tommy from her arms. "Come down to breakfast when you're ready," the housekeeper said. "Kieran eats early before heading out to work, but I've kept food warm for you." In the kitchen, Clara found a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread waiting for her. She ate while Mrs. Patterson fed Tommy, and through the window she could see Kieran and several ranch hands working with horses in the corral. He moved with easy confidence, his body language speaking of years of experience and natural ability. Even from this distance, Clara could see the respect his men showed him, the way they listened when he spoke and moved quickly to follow his instructions. "He's a good man," Mrs. Patterson said, following Clara's gaze. "Best I've ever known, and I've known plenty in my years. He works harder than any of his hands, never asks anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself, and pays fair wages. After his mother died, there were those who thought he'd sell this place and move on, but Kieran wouldn't hear of it. This land was his father's dream and his mother's legacy, and he's devoted himself to honoring them both by making the ranch prosper." "He said his father died when he was young," Clara asked. Mrs. Patterson nodded sadly. "A riding accident when Kieran was just 10 years old. His horse spooked during a storm and threw him. He hit his head on a rock and never woke up. Kieran's mother, Margaret, was devastated, but she was also determined not to lose the ranch her husband had built. She kept it going through sheer will and hard work, and taught Kieran everything she knew about ranching and horses and cattle. When she took sick 3 years ago, Kieran was at her bedside every moment he could spare. She died knowing her son would continue what she and her husband had started." Clara felt her throat tighten at the story. Kieran had known loss, had experienced abandonment of a different kind when his father was taken from him too soon. Perhaps that was why he had been so quick to help her and Tommy, because he understood what it meant to suddenly be alone, to have the foundation of your world ripped away. "I want to earn my place here," Clara said firmly. "Tell me what needs doing and I'll do it." Mrs. Patterson smiled approvingly. "I can see you're not afraid of hard work, child, and that's good because there's plenty of it. But today, you're still recovering. Help me with light tasks, folding laundry, preparing vegetables for dinner, that sort of thing. We'll work up to the heavier chores gradually." The day passed quickly as Clara settled into the rhythms of the household. She discovered that Mrs. Patterson was an excellent teacher patient and thorough in her explanations. The older woman showed her where everything was stored, how Kieran liked things done, and shared stories about life on the ranch that helped Clara feel less like a stranger and more like part of the place. Tommy was a delight, charming Mrs. Patterson with his smiles and baby chatter. The housekeeper found toys that had belonged to Kieran as a child, carved wooden animals and soft cloth balls, and Tommy played happily on a blanket in the kitchen while the women worked. Kieran came in for the midday meal with his foreman, a weathered man in his 40s named Samuel. Both men were dusty and tired, but they brightened when they saw food on the table. Kieran's eyes sought out Clara immediately, and he smiled when he saw her wearing his mother's dress. "It suits you," he said simply, and Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you," she murmured. "Mrs. Patterson has been very kind in helping me get settled. I'm glad to hear it." Kieran sat down and served himself a generous portion of the stew Clara and Mrs. Patterson had prepared. "How are you feeling today?" "Better, I hope." "Much better," Clara assured him. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for us. I promise I'll work hard to repay your kindness." "It's not a debt," Kieran said, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't owe me anything, Clara. This is your home now, yours and Tommy's, for as long as you want it to be." Samuel glanced between Kieran and Clara with interest, a knowing gleam in his eyes that made Clara blush even deeper. She focused on her own plate, very aware of Kieran's presence across the table. He had rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and tanned from long days in the sun. There was a small cut on the back of his left hand, fresh enough that it still oozed a bit of blood. "You're hurt," Clara said before she could stop herself. Kieran looked down at his hand as though surprised to see the injury. "Just a scratch from a fence post. It's nothing." "It should be cleaned and bandaged properly," Clara insisted. "Infection is nothing to take lightly." Mrs. Patterson looked pleased. "The medical supplies are in the cabinet by the sink, dear. Why don't you tend to that after we eat?" So after the meal, Clara found herself sitting beside Kieran at the kitchen table, carefully cleaning the cut on his hand. He held very still, watching her face as she worked with gentle efficiency. Up close, Clara could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of years of squinting into the sun, and a small scar on his chin that looked like it might have come from a childhood accident. "You have a healer's touch," Kieran observed quietly. Clara shook her head. "I just don't want to see you suffer from something that could easily be prevented. My mother taught me basic nursing skills. She said every woman should know how to care for wounds and illnesses. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." Clara finished wrapping the bandage around Kieran's hand and tied it off neatly. "I miss her every day. I wish she could have known Tommy, could have seen him grow." "I think she knows," Kieran said softly, "and I think she'd be proud of the way you've taken care of him." Clara looked up and found Kieran's face very close to hers, his eyes warm and sincere. For a moment, neither of them moved, and Clara felt something shift in the air between them, a connection forming that went beyond gratitude or simple kindness. Then Tommy let out a squeal from his spot on the floor, and the spell was broken. Clara pulled back quickly, her heart pounding. "I should help Mrs. Patterson with the dishes," she said, standing up perhaps more abruptly than necessary. If Kieran noticed her discomfort, he was gentleman enough not to comment on it. He simply thanked her for tending his injury and headed back outside to continue his work. The days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself settling into life at the ranch with surprising ease. She and Mrs. Patterson developed an efficient partnership, dividing the household tasks between them in a way that played to their individual strengths. Clara discovered she had a talent for cooking and took over most of the meal preparation. Mrs. Patterson focused on the cleaning and laundry, though Clara helped with those tasks as well when Tommy was napping. Tommy thrived in the stable, loving environment. He began walking steadily, toddling around the house and yard with fearless enthusiasm. Kieran seemed to have endless patience with the little boy, carrying him on his shoulders and teaching him the names of the horses. Tommy adored Kieran, calling him Key in his baby voice and reaching for him whenever the cowboy came into view. Clara watched their interactions with a heart that felt simultaneously full and confused. She had tried to maintain emotional distance from Kieran, to remember that he was her employer and benefactor, nothing more. But it was impossible not to be affected by his consistent kindness, his quiet strength, the way he treated both her and Tommy as though they were genuinely important to him, rather than charity cases he had taken on. And there were moments, increasingly frequent moments, when Clara caught Kieran looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Moments when their hands would brush while reaching for the same dish, and the contact would linger just a heartbeat longer than necessary. Moments when she would turn and find him watching her with Tommy, something tender and almost wistful in his eyes. Clara didn't know what to make of it. She was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that a man like Kieran Nash could see her as anything more than a responsibility. She was damaged goods in society's eyes, a woman whose own father had abandoned her, with a baby brother to care for and no prospects or dowry to offer. What could she possibly have that would interest a successful rancher who could have his pick of any woman in the territory? But hope was a stubborn thing, and despite her best efforts to crush it, Clara felt it growing in her chest every time Kieran smiled at her. One evening, about 6 weeks after Clara's arrival at the ranch, Kieran asked her to walk with him after dinner. Mrs. Patterson volunteered to watch Tommy, shooing them out the door with a knowing smile that made Clara's stomach flutter with nerves. They walked in comfortable silence at first, heading toward the corral where several horses dozed in the fading light. The mountains in the distance were painted gold and purple by the setting sun, and the air had cooled to a pleasant temperature after the heat of the day. "I wanted to thank you," Kieran said finally, breaking the silence, "for everything you've done around here. The difference you and Tommy have made in this place. I don't know if I can properly express it." Clara looked at him in surprise. "I should be thanking you. You saved our lives, Kieran. You gave us a home when we had nothing." "You've given me something too," Kieran said quietly. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "This house felt empty after my mother died. It was just a structure, a place to sleep between work days. But since you've been here, it feels like a home again. There's laughter and life and warmth. You've brought light back into this place, Clara, and I'm grateful for that." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Kieran must be able to hear it. "I'm glad we could help," she managed to say. "It's more than that." Kieran took a step closer, and Clara could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the vulnerability of a man about to risk something precious. "Clara, I need to be honest with you. These past weeks, getting to know you, watching you with Tommy, seeing your strength and kindness and courage, I've developed feelings for you. Real feelings, not just respect or gratitude. I think about you constantly. When I'm out working, I find myself looking forward to meals just because it means I'll see you. When I watch you singing to Tommy or laughing at something Mrs. Patterson said, my chest aches with how beautiful you are." Clara couldn't breathe. She stared at Kieran, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You have feelings for me," she whispered. "I do," Kieran confirmed. "Strong feelings, and I understand if you don't feel the same way. You've been through so much, and the last thing I want is to make you uncomfortable in what should be your home. But I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I needed you to know." "Kieran," Clara said, and her voice shook with emotion. I feel the same way. I've been trying not to, trying to convince myself it was just gratitude or dependence, but it's so much more than that. You're the kindest, most honorable man I've ever known. When I look at you, I see everything I could ever want in a partner, a friend, a husband. Kieran suggested softly, and Clara's eyes widened. Is that what you're asking? She breathed. Not yet, Kieran said, a smile tugging at his lips. When I ask you to marry me, Clara Thompson, it will be after I've courted you properly, shown you all the romance and respect you deserve. But I wanted you to know my intentions are serious. I'm not playing games or offering temporary affection. When I look at you and Tommy, I see my future. I see the family I want to build. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but these were happy tears, tears of joy and relief and overwhelming love. I'll be family to you, she said, echoing his words with her own vow. Tommy and I will be your family if you'll truly have us. I'll be family to you both, Kieran said fiercely. That's a promise, Clara. From this day forward, you're mine to protect and cherish, and Tommy is my responsibility as much as if he were my own blood. No one will ever abandon you again. No one will ever make you feel unwanted or unloved. I swear it. Then Kieran cupped Clara's face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palms, and kissed her. It was sweet and tender and full of promise, and Clara felt as though her heart might burst from happiness. She kissed him back, pouring all of her feelings into the contact, trying to convey without words how much this meant to her, how much he meant to her. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Kieran rested his forehead against Clara's and smiled. I'm going to court you properly, he said. I'm going to take you on picnics and buy you pretty things and write you terrible poetry that will make you laugh. And when enough time has passed that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that this is real and right, I'm going to ask you to be my wife. Is that acceptable to you? More than acceptable, Clara assured him, laughing through her tears. It sounds perfect. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when Mrs. Patterson saw them, she didn't even try to hide her satisfied smile. About time, she muttered. But there was affection in her voice. True to his word, Kieran courted Clara with old-fashioned dedication and creativity. He took her on a picnic to a beautiful meadow filled with wildflowers, where they ate fried chicken and fresh bread while Tommy chased butterflies. He brought her small gifts, a pretty hair ribbon from the general store in Fort Garland, a smooth river stone that caught the light, a book of poetry that he read to her in the evenings. He did indeed write her terrible poetry, awful rhyming verses about her eyes and smile that made Clara laugh until her sides hurt. But beneath the humor, there was real emotion in those words, genuine attempts to express feelings that were perhaps too big for any language to fully capture. Kieran was also true to his promise to treat Tommy as his own. He spent hours with the little boy, teaching him about the ranch and the animals, carrying him around on his shoulders, and reading him stories before bed. Tommy came to think of Kieran as a father figure, and Kieran embraced that role with wholehearted devotion. Clara fell more in love with him every day. She loved the way he was patient with the horses, firm but never cruel. She loved how he treated his ranch hands with respect, remembering details about their lives and families. She loved his laugh, rare but genuine when it came. She loved the way he looked at her, as though she was the most precious thing in his world. 3 months after their first kiss, Kieran took Clara riding up into the foothills of the mountains. It was a beautiful autumn day, the aspens turning gold and the air crisp and clean. They rode to a high point that offered a sweeping view of the ranch and the valley beyond, and Kieran helped Clara dismount. "This was my father's favorite spot," he said, looking out over the landscape. "He used to bring my mother up here when they were courting. He proposed to her right here on this exact spot. Clara's heart began to race. Did he? Kieran turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. Clara Thompson, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You've brought joy and purpose and love into my days. You've made my house a home and given me a future worth dreaming about. I love you with everything I am, and I love Tommy as though he were my own son. I want to make this official, to bind us together in the eyes of God and the law and everyone who knows us. He dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond, elegant in its modesty. Will you marry me, Clara? Will you be my wife and let me be Tommy's father and build a life with me here on this land? Yes, Clara said immediately, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Kieran, 1,000 times yes. I love you so much. I want nothing more than to be your wife. Kieran stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and cried simultaneously. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made specifically for her. They kissed there on the mountain, sealing their promise with all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them for months. When they returned to the ranch and announced their engagement, Mrs. Patterson actually cried. I knew it, she kept saying. I knew the moment Kieran brought you home that this was meant to be. Oh, Margaret would have been so happy. She wanted nothing more than to see her son settled with a good woman. The wedding was held 6 weeks later in Fort Garland's small church. It was a simple ceremony, attended by Mrs. Patterson, the ranch hands, and a few of Kieran's friends from town. Clara wore a dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, white cotton with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Tommy served as an adorable if unpredictable ring bearer, toddling down the aisle with the rings tied to a small pillow that he found far more interesting than his actual task. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran kissed Clara with such feeling that several of the ranch hands whistled and cheered. Clara didn't care. She was married to the man she loved, the man who had saved her life and given her a future. She was Clara Nash now, and Tommy would grow up as Thomas Nash, with a father who had chosen to love him rather than one who had abandoned him. The reception was held at the ranch, with Mrs. Patterson outdoing herself on the food and one of the ranch hands producing a fiddle for dancing. Kieran danced with Clara under the stars, holding her close and whispering promises of love and devotion. Later, after the guests had departed and Tommy was asleep in his bed, Kieran carried Clara over the threshold of what was now truly their home. Their wedding night was everything Clara could have hoped for, tender and passionate, gentle and fierce, a physical expression of the love they had declared in words. Kieran was careful with her, attentive to her needs and comfort, making sure her first experience of intimacy was full of pleasure rather than pain. Clara gave herself to him completely, trusting him with her body as she already trusted him with her heart. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Kieran's bed, their bed now, and talked about their dreams for the future. Kieran wanted to expand the ranch, perhaps add some sheep to their livestock. Clara wanted to start a vegetable garden in the spring, and maybe some chickens for fresh eggs. They talked about Tommy, about raising him to be a good man who treated others with respect and kindness. And they talked, tentatively but hopefully, about having children of their own someday, brothers and sisters for Tommy to grow up with. I want a big family, Kieran confessed, running his fingers through Clara's hair. 4 or 5 children, maybe more. I want this house filled with noise and chaos and love. Is that something you want too? Yes, Clara said without hesitation. I want to give Tommy siblings, and I want to give you children, Kieran. I want to build the kind of family neither of us had, one that's stable and loving and forever. Forever, Kieran echoed, kissing her forehead. That's exactly what we'll have, Clara. I promise you that. The first year of their marriage was one of adjustment and growth. Clara learned the ins and outs of running a ranch household, becoming more confident in her role as Kieran's wife and partner. She discovered she had a talent for the business side of ranching, helping Kieran keep the books and manage contracts with buyers. Her education had been limited, but she was quick with numbers and had good instincts about negotiations. Tommy grew like a weed, transforming from a baby into a bright, energetic little boy. He called Kieran Papa now, and Kieran fairly glowed with pride every time he heard it. The resemblance between them wasn't physical, but in mannerisms and expressions. Tommy was clearly becoming Kieran's son in every way that mattered. Clara's relationship with Kieran deepened as they learned to navigate marriage together. They had their disagreements. Of course, Clara was stubborn and Kieran could be overbearing in his desire to protect her, but they learned to communicate and compromise. More importantly, they never let the sun set on their anger, always talking through problems before bed so they could sleep peacefully in each other's arms. About 18 months after their wedding, Clara realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she thought it was just stress or a temporary irregularity, but when the nausea began in the mornings and her breasts became tender, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. Clara waited to tell Kieran until she was certain, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. When she finally shared the news one evening after dinner, Kieran's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of joy, picked her up and spun her carefully, then immediately set her down again as though afraid he might hurt her. "Are you sure?" he demanded, his hands cupping her face. "You're certain?" "I'm certain," Clara confirmed, laughing at his expression of mingled excitement and terror. "We're going to have a baby, Kieran. Tommy is going to be a big brother." "A baby," Kieran repeated wonderingly. He dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to Clara's still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your papa. I can't wait to meet you. We're going to give you such a good life, I promise." Clara ran her fingers through Kieran's hair, her heart overflowing with love. This man, who had once been a stranger, was now her entire world. He had given her everything: safety, security, family, love. And now they were creating new life together, a child that would be part of both of them, Mrs. Patterson fussed over Clara throughout the pregnancy, insisting she rest more and do less physical work. Kieran was even worse, hovering anxiously and trying to prevent Clara from doing anything more strenuous than sitting in a chair. Clara bore their concern with good humor, touched by how much they cared even when their overprotectiveness became annoying. Tommy was excited about becoming a big brother, though Clara suspected he didn't fully understand what it meant. He liked to pat her growing belly and talk to the baby, telling it about the horses and the dogs and all the things they would do together. The pregnancy progressed normally, and as Clara's belly swelled with new life, her happiness seemed to grow proportionally. She had never imagined, during those desperate days lost in the wilderness, that her life could become this full and rich. She had been abandoned and hopeless, certain she and Tommy would die alone. But Kieran had found them, had saved them, and had given them not just survival but a life worth living. Clara went into labor on a warm spring afternoon, 6 months after discovering she was pregnant. The pain started gradually, and Clara sent one of the ranch hands to fetch the midwife from Fort Garland while Mrs. Patterson prepared the bedroom. Kieran paced like a caged animal, terrified in a way Clara had never seen him before. "Women do this every day," Clara reminded him gently between contractions. "I'll be all right, Kieran. We'll be all right." "Your mother died in childbirth," Kieran said, his voice rough with fear. "Clara, if anything happened to you, I couldn't bear it. You're my whole world." Clara took his hand and squeezed hard. "Nothing is going to happen to me. I'm strong, and Mrs. Patterson and the midwife know what they're doing. Trust me, Kieran. Trust that I'll fight to come back to you." The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. But Clara was determined, gritting her teeth through the pain and pushing when the midwife told her to. Kieran stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, his face pale but his presence steady. Finally, just as dawn broke over the mountains, Clara gave one final push and heard the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. The midwife held up the infant, still covered in blood and vernix, and announced, "It's a boy, a healthy baby boy." Kieran let out a choked sob of relief and joy, kissing Clara's sweaty forehead over and over. "You did it," he kept saying. "Clara, you did it. He's perfect. You're perfect." The midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Clara's arms. Clara looked down at her son, hers and Kieran's, and felt her heart expand to impossible proportions. He had a shock of dark hair like his father and Clara's delicate features. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were blue like all newborns, but Clara suspected they would eventually turn brown like hers. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world. We've been waiting for you." Kieran reached out with one finger to stroke the baby's soft cheek, his expression full of wonder. "He's so small," he marveled. "So perfect. Clara, we made this. We created a person." They named him Kenneth Nash after Kieran's father. Tommy was brought in to meet his new brother, and the 3-year-old was surprisingly gentle, touching the baby's tiny hand with cautious curiosity. "Baby brother," he announced proudly. "My baby." "Yes, your baby brother," Clara agreed, smiling. "You have to help Mama and Papa take care of him, all right? Big brothers are very important." Tommy nodded seriously, clearly taking his new responsibility to heart. The weeks after Kenneth's birth were exhausting but wonderful. Clara recovered quickly from the labor, and Kenneth proved to be a relatively easy baby, sleeping in decent stretches and nursing well. Kieran was a devoted father, walking the floor with Kenneth when he cried and changing nappies without complaint. Watching him with their son, Clara fell in love with her husband all over again. As Kenneth grew from an infant into a baby, and then a toddler, the Nash household was filled with the chaos Kieran had wished for. Tommy was an energetic boy who loved the outdoors and begged constantly to be allowed to help with the ranch work. Kieran taught him patiently, showing him how to curry horses and feed chickens, and all the small tasks a young boy could manage. 2 years after Kenneth's birth, Clara became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and she delivered a daughter they named Catherine on a snowy winter evening. Catherine was a beautiful baby with Kieran's coloring and Clara's stubborn temperament, and she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment of her birth. The years passed in a blur of love and work and family. Tommy grew into a responsible young man who worked the ranch alongside Kieran, learning everything his adoptive father could teach him about livestock and land management. He never spoke of his biological father, and Clara was grateful that he seemed to have no memory of the man who had abandoned them. As far as Tommy was concerned, Kieran was his father in every way that mattered, and their bond was unbreakable. Kenneth was quieter than his older brother, but equally devoted to the ranch. He had a way with horses that reminded Clara of Kieran, a natural ability to understand and communicate with the animals that couldn't quite be taught. Catherine was the family's wild card, full of spirit and determination. She insisted on learning to ride as young as her brothers, refused to be left behind on ranch activities, and announced at age 6, that she intended to run the place someday. Kieran encouraged her ambitions, teaching her the business side of ranching alongside the practical skills. When Catherine was 4 years old, Clara became pregnant one final time. She was in her early 30s now, and both she and Kieran agreed this would likely be their last child. The pregnancy was harder than the previous ones, and Clara was often tired and uncomfortable. But when she delivered twin boys, Kellen and Kyle, on a beautiful spring morning, the difficulty was forgotten in the joy of holding two healthy babies. With 5 children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, the Nash household was everything Kieran had dreamed of. The house echoed with laughter and arguments, with the thunder of running feet and the babble of childish voices. Mrs. Patterson, now quite elderly but still insisting on helping where she could, often sat in her rocking chair and smiled at the chaos, pleased to see the home so full of life. Clara sometimes paused in her daily work cooking meals, tending the garden, managing the household accounts, and marveled at how her life had turned out. She thought occasionally of her father, wondered if he was still alive somewhere, or if the wilderness had claimed him as it nearly had claimed her. But she found she bore him no ill will any more. His abandonment, terrible as it had been, had led her to Kieran. It had brought her to this life, this family, this happiness she had never imagined possible. One evening, when the children were all asleep and the house was finally quiet, Clara and Kieran sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Kieran had his arm around Clara's shoulders, and she leaned against him with the comfortable ease of 20 years of marriage. "Do you remember the day I found you?" Kieran asked quietly. "You and Tommy out in the wilderness, more dead than alive." "I remember," Clara said. "I thought we were finished. I thought that was how our story would end." "Instead, it was just the beginning," Kieran said. He turned to look at her, his eyes still holding that same warmth and love they had held when he first told her his feelings all those years ago. "You've given me everything, Clara. A home, a family, a purpose beyond just existing. Every day I thank God that I decided to ride west that afternoon, that I happened to be in exactly the right place to find you." "I'm the one who should be thanking God," Clara countered. "You saved my life, Kieran. You saved Tommy's life, and you've given us both so much more than just survival. You've given us love and security and belonging. You became our family when we had no one." "I'll be family to you both," Kieran quoted softly, repeating the words he had spoken so long ago. "That was my promise, and I've spent every day since trying to keep it." "You've more than kept it," Clara assured him. She took his hand and squeezed it gently. "You've been the best husband and father anyone could ask for. Our children are blessed to have you, and so am I." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear the faint sounds of one of the twins crying and then quieting, probably comforted by Tommy, who had volunteered to watch his younger siblings for the evening. "We did good, didn't we?" Kieran said finally. "With our family, our life here." "We did wonderful," Clara confirmed. She turned in his arms and kissed him soft and sweet. "And we're not finished yet. We still have years ahead of us, watching our children grow, watching them build lives of their own. Maybe someday we'll be grandparents with a whole new generation running around." Kieran smiled, and in that smile Clara saw the young cowboy who had rescued her, the man who had promised to be family to her and Tommy, the devoted husband and father he had become. "I look forward to every moment," he said. "As long as I have you beside me, Clara, I have everything I need." The years continued to pass, marked by milestones both big and small. Tommy grew into a man and eventually took over more of the day-to-day running of the ranch, allowing Kieran to slow down a bit as he entered his 50s. He married a sweet girl from Fort Garland named Sarah, and they had children of their own, making Kieran and Clara grandparents for the first time. Kenneth followed his brother's example, marrying young and staying close to the ranch, building a house on Nash land for his own growing family. Catherine, true to her childhood declaration, proved to have a brilliant head for business and took over managing the financial side of the ranch operations. The twins, always inseparable, worked together training horses, developing a reputation throughout Colorado for producing excellent stock. Through it all, Kieran and Clara remained at the heart of the family, their love for each other as strong as ever despite the silver threading through their hair, and the lines time etched into their faces. They took joy in their children and grandchildren, in the legacy they were building together, in the simple pleasure of sitting on the porch in the evening and watching the sun set over land they had nurtured and protected. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were 3 generations of Nashes present now, along with Mrs. Patterson, who at nearly 90 years old still insisted on baking the anniversary cake herself. The house and yard overflowed with people, with love, with the kind of boisterous joy that came from family, who genuinely liked each other as well as loved each other. Tommy stood to make a toast, raising his glass of cider and waiting for the crowd to quiet. 30 years ago, he began, his voice carrying easily across the gathering. Mama and Papa got married in Fort Garland's little church. But their story really began a year before that, when Papa found Mama and me lost in the wilderness and made a choice that changed all our lives. He chose to help strangers when he could have ridden past. He chose to open his home and his heart when he could have kept them closed. And in doing so, he gave me a father, gave Mama a husband, and started the family we're all part of today. Tommy's voice grew thick with emotion, and he paused to clear his throat. I don't remember my biological father. I don't remember being abandoned. My first real memories are of this place, of Papa teaching me to ride, of Mama singing while she cooked, of feeling safe and loved. Papa didn't have to be my father. There was no blood obligation, no legal requirement. But he chose to love me as his own, and that choice has made all the difference in my life. So this toast is to Papa and Mama. Thank you for showing all of us what real love looks like, what real family means. Thank you for building something beautiful out of tragedy, for creating a legacy of love that will continue for generations. We love you both more than words can express. As the family raised their glasses and drank, Clara felt tears streaming down her face. Kieran pulled her close, his own eyes suspiciously wet, and kissed the top of her head. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, offering hugs and love, and Clara felt overwhelmed by the richness of her life. That night, after the guests had departed and the house was clean, Clara and Kieran walked out to the spot where he had first brought her on horseback all those years ago. The moon was bright, casting silver light over the ranch, and in the distance they could hear the gentle sounds of horses shifting in their sleep. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Clara asked, leaning against Kieran's chest. "When you found me and Tommy that day, did you have any idea where it would lead?" Kieran was quiet for a moment, considering. "I knew you were special," he finally said. "From that first moment when you begged me to help Tommy even though you were dying yourself, I knew you were someone extraordinary. But did I imagine falling in love with you, marrying you, building all of this together? No, I didn't imagine it. I couldn't have imagined anything this wonderful. I was so scared that day," Clara confessed. "I thought we were going to die. And then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I had barely had time to form. You gave us life, Kieran. You gave us everything. We gave each other everything, Kieran corrected gently. You think you got more from me, but Clara, you saved me too. I was alone in this big house, working myself to exhaustion to avoid feeling the emptiness. You filled that emptiness with light and love. You gave me a reason to come home every night, a purpose beyond just maintaining the ranch. You and Tommy, and then our children, you're my reason for everything. Clara turned in his arms and looked up at her husband, this man who had been her savior, her lover, her partner, her best friend. His face was lined now, his hair more silver than brown, but to her he was as handsome as the day she had first truly seen him, kneeling beside her in the wilderness with water and kindness in his hands. I love you, Kieran Nash, she said firmly. I have loved you since the day you promised to be family to me and Tommy. I will love you until the day I die, and if there's anything after that, I'll love you there too. And I love you, Clara Nash, Kieran replied, his voice rough with emotion. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You and our family are my greatest achievement, my proudest accomplishment. Every day with you is a gift I never take for granted. They kissed there in the moonlight, on the land they had built their life upon, surrounded by the evidence of their love in the form of children and grandchildren sleeping peacefully in houses scattered across the property. And Clara thought that if she could go back and speak to her younger self, that desperate, frightened girl abandoned in the wilderness, she would tell her to hold on just a little longer. She would tell her that help was coming, that love was coming, that a future more beautiful than she could imagine was just on the horizon. She would tell her that sometimes, when everything seems darkest, when you're certain there's no hope left, a cowboy rides out of nowhere and changes your entire world. He looks at you and your baby brother and says, I'll be family to you both, and he means it with his whole heart. And that promise becomes the foundation of a love story that spans decades, that creates new life, that builds a legacy of love that will echo through generations. Clara had been abandoned, yes, but in that abandonment, she had found something far greater than what she had lost. She had found Kieran, and in finding him, she had found her home, her family, her forever. And as she stood in her husband's arms under the Colorado stars, Clara knew with absolute certainty that every hardship, every moment of fear and desperation, had been worth it to arrive at this perfect happiness. Her story, which had begun with such tragedy and pain, had become one of enduring love and joy. And it was far from over. There were still years ahead, still grandchildren to be born, still sunsets to watch and moments to cherish. But the foundation was solid, built on a promise made by a good man to a desperate woman and the baby she refused to abandon. I'll be family to you both, he had said, and he had spent 31 years proving the truth of those words. And Clara knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from a lifetime of being cherished, that he would continue to prove it for as long as they both lived. Their love story, born in the harsh wilderness of the Colorado Territory, had bloomed into something beautiful and enduring. And as Clara rested her head against Kieran's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, she knew that this love, this family, this life they had built together was everything she had never dared to dream of during those dark days of abandonment. She had been lost, and Kieran had found her. She had been abandoned, and Kieran had chosen her. She had been dying, and Kieran had given her life. Not just physical survival, but a life worth living, filled with love and laughter and purpose. And for that, Clara would be grateful every single day for the rest of her life. Their story was one of rescue and redemption, of promises kept and love that conquered fear. It was a story that would be told and retold through the generations of Nashes to come. A reminder that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures, and that love, real, enduring, chosen love can transform everything. As Kieran and Clara finally headed back toward the house, hand in hand as always, the moon watched over the Nash ranch with silver approval. The land was quiet now, peaceful, but it held within it decades of stories, of hard work and dedication, of children raised and love declared, of a family built not just on blood but on choice and commitment and unwavering devotion. And at the heart of it all was a simple promise made by a cowboy to a desperate young woman and her baby brother. "I'll be family to you both." It was a promise that had shaped lives, created generations, and proved that sometimes, when you're at your lowest point, when you've been abandoned and forgotten, that's exactly when your true family finds you. Not the family you're born into, but the family you choose and who chooses you in return. That was the Nash legacy, the foundation of everything they had built. And it would endure for as long as there were people to remember that love, real love, isn't about blood or obligation. It's about seeing someone in need and saying, "I'll help." It's about making a promise and keeping it, day after day, year after year. It's about choosing every single day to be family to someone who needs it. And in the end, that choice had made all the difference.